And say hello again from CILC's Community of Learning. We are so excited to be here at the International Wolf Center. Thanks so much for stopping by. We are so excited to learn along with you.
Hey, perfect. All right, then I'll go ahead and get started. So let me quickly introduce myself really quick. So my name is Elizabeth, and I'm an educator here at the International Wolf Center. And today we're really going to be learning about wolf reintroduction. So we'll talk a little bit about what wolf reintroduction even is, why we do it, some of the impacts, and some of the ways we actually do wolf reintroduction. And at the end, we'll kind of wrap up by going through a few examples of those reintroductions and kind of what we've seen from them. And then once we are done with the lesson, we will have a whole question and answering session where hopefully I will be able to answer any questions that you have. Now, before we get started with the lesson, I did just want to share my screen here first to go to our live cameras. So these are our cameras here at the International Wolf Center. So it looks like our wolves got a little bit of a treat to kind of help wake them up for us. A little bit of food aggression from Grayson there. So let me quickly introduce the wolves that we have here at the center. So I'll first start with our two young boys. They look very, very similar. They are brothers, which is going to be Blackstone and Kaz. Blackstone is the wolf to the right. Uh, or Kaz is the one to the right, Blackstone is the one to the left. I also have trouble telling them apart. And these two wolves are 2 years old, so they're kind of the babies of our pack. They tend to have a lot of energetic behaviors. They chase each other around. They still go after bugs. They play with snowflakes and sticks, all those super fun pup behaviors. While Grayson, this fully white wolf here, is our eldest. He is 8 years old, so he does kind of hold the father role of our pack, kind of leading the way there. He does tend to correct our younger boys, especially Kaz, when they get a little out of hand. And then lastly, we have Rika, which I was hoping she might come out and hang out with us, but it seems like she's really enjoying her snooze. Wolves are typically more active around sunset and sunrise, so it seems like Rika was not interested in the enrichment we wanted to give them. But hopefully, when we're done with our lesson and we enter our question and answering session, I'll hop back on our live cameras and hopefully maybe be able to see Rika while we answer all of those super fun questions. But with that, I think I'll go ahead and get started with the lesson here. So let me pop that up for us. There we go. All right. So like I mentioned, we're really going to be learning all about wolf reintroduction. Now, before we get into that, I really just want to quickly touch on the International Wolf Center and really what we're here for. So we're located up in Ely, Minnesota, super far up north. We've always had a pretty good, healthy gray wolf population here. So we thought it was a really good place to kind of set up camp and teach people about this species of wolf. Now, really our main goal here is that we want to use science-based education to teach and inspire the world about wolves, their ecology, and the wolf-human relationship. So really, our main goal is doing exactly what I'm doing right now, is just teaching you guys about these wolves. We are not here to tell you how to think or feel about these animals or shape your opinions on them. We're really just here to give you as much scientific info as we can so that then you have the tools to make your own educated opinions. Now here we have some introduction slides. I'm glad we at least got to see 3 out of 4 of our wolves living here. So we'll just do a quick recap. We have Grayson, who is 8 years old, and then we have Rika, who we did not get to see, but this is our 3-year-old female. And then last but not least, we have our 2 youngest brother duo here, Blackstone and Kaz. Now, to kind of start off talking about wolf reintroductions, I first want to touch on what species of wolf we're even talking about. So there are 2 species of wolf officially recognized in the world, and that is the gray wolf, which is found all over the northern hemisphere, as well as you might know them as a few different names. People also call them timber wolves, Arctic wolves, plain wolves. All of those different animals are still our gray wolf. And then the other species is going to be the red wolf. Now, red wolves are critically endangered. There is not a lot of them anymore, which we'll actually talk about some of their past ranges and kind of how that reintroduction is occurring today and has happened in the past. Our gray wolves, they're what we call threatened. So basically what that means is in some areas of the world, they have really healthy populations of these animals, and in other areas, they do not. So kind of a good way of visualizing that. Here we have a range map for our gray wolves. So what we're seeing here is the blue coloration is where we still see active, healthy wolf pack populations today. And in the red areas are where wolves have been historically extirpated. So what that means is they've been removed from there, either due to overhunting or habitat fragmentation. So, because of this removing of an animal, we do see some ecosystem changes that might affect them negatively or maybe not affect them at all. So, reintroduction also has a lot of thought process of what ecosystem might benefit from these wolves and what might be fine without them. So, really, these red areas are where we're focusing on when it comes to that reintroduction. But I keep saying wolf reintroduction. Let's kind of talk about what that even is. So populations, they need enough individuals within them in order to have good genetic diversity. So basically what that means, if there's too many animals in a population, they're not going to be able to expand or keep that healthy level of numbers of individuals. As well, maybe like here in the United States, those wolves were completely removed. So there's not even a small population, there's none in general. So these reintroductions are really to increase those populations either to their historical sizes or to just help some of those populations along with that genetic diversity. So just more individuals in that population. And now we'll kind of talk about some methods to these reintroductions. There's a few different ways on how we can do this, as well as usually they're going to be done for different reasons due to what we're actually trying to accomplish. So the first thing we'll talk about is really just adult releases. Now, when it comes to adult releases, this can be a wolf that was born in captivity, so a wolf born under human care, or a wolf out in the wild. Now, typically, we're going to want to pick wolves that are around 2 to 5 years old. Now, this age range is when wolves are maturing. So at that point, they're trying to look for a new mate and to create their own pack. So it's a really great age range to start increasing those wolf populations. Additionally, for wolves born under that human care, they're typically also going to be tried to raised by some other wolves that kind of already know some of those wild skills so that they are prepared to enter that wild space even though they were born in captivity. Now we also sometimes use wild wolves, just moving them from one area to the next to kind of help out that ecosystem. Now when it comes to these adult releases, there are two different ways on how we can actually do this. First, we have our soft or gradual release, and then we have our hard or immediate release. Now, when it comes to a soft release, this is basically just a gradual introduction to this new wildland that they're going to be occupying and living in. Now, as we can see, our wolves are going to be put in what we call an acclimation pen. So basically, it's an enclosed area within the ecosystem they're eventually going to be living in. Now, researchers will supplement them with food, basically carcasses that we find around the area to help them feed and also kind of know what species they're probably going to be interacting with in this new area. Now, when it comes to wolves born in captivity, this is typically one of the more easier ways to kind of acclimate them to the wild. However, it might be obvious, but this method takes a lot of resources and it takes a lot of time. Typically, these wolves are in these acclimation pens for 30 or less days, as well as it can be a little stressful for these wolves as well. Having human interaction can be really stressful for these animals. So although the researchers tried to do the interaction as little as possible, we still have to give them those carcasses. So definitely there are some pros and cons to our soft release as well. But then we also have our hard release. Now this also has some pros and cons. So hard release, that is really when we're just immediately releasing that wolf into the wild. Now, like I mentioned, when it comes to our wolves born under kind of that human care, they first need to have as little human interaction as possible. So really avoiding socialization. We do not want to get a wolf used to humans that is going to be released into the wild, right? Getting them used to humans might lead to them approaching us a lot more, and we do not want to do that. Or they might even rely on us on food, which is also not good for a wild wolf. Now, when it comes to wild wolves being moved from one place to the other, these hard releases can be a little bit complicated. A lot of the times, wild wolves will just simply walk all the way back to their home. Wolves are very good travelers, and they will travel hundreds and hundreds of miles to go back from where they came from. Now, although there is some of those cons there, this is also just an easier way for researchers to really get a wolf reintroduction started. And obviously, you don't need as many resources for that as well. So hard releases are a bit more of a realistic thing that researchers can do, especially if they don't have many resources or a lot of funding. But again, we also have some of those setbacks as well, like wolves just walking back home. So this right here is an example of a hard release. So this is a video taken on Isle Royale. And so what we have here is our wolf. Our scientists simply kind of left this crate so that the wolf could be comfortable and just leave on their own. You might be able to notice that they have what we call a radio collar or a GPS collar, as well as a tag on their ear. Now, tags on their ear isn't used all the time, but it does help identify each individual wolf. And those are how they really track the wolves to make sure that they're healthy, they're making a pack, and really monitoring how that population is doing after these hard releases. Now, what if we do not want to release an adult wolf? What if we want to work towards more releasing pups into an ecosystem? Then we would use what we call cross-fostering. Now, cross-fostering, that is when we take a wolf born under human care and put them in a wild active den site. So basically, to increase the wild population, we're putting in a wolf born in captivity in that wild den. Basically just increasing the population by giving them more pups. Now, this was really a method developed by the Red Wolf Recovery Program back in the 1990s. So this right here is a video of those two pups. This was one of the first times they started that cross-fostering. And with that, there's actually a lot of things that researchers have to keep in mind when doing this cross-fostering. So some of the things that we have to really make sure that we're getting right is timing and expected births. So we need to make sure that our mother wolf born in captivity is giving birth around the same time a wild wolf is. So the reason for that is because when we put those pups in that den site, we want them to be a very similar age to the ones already in the den. Not only does that make it a little easier for those pups to acclimate with the rest of their new siblings, but also allows that adult wolf to not be maybe thrown off by two wolves being much older or much younger than the rest of their litter there. We also want to find these den sites within 10 days. Now, the reason that this 10-day time period kind of exists, or why 10 days is really a good range, is because that 10-day time frame allows us to monitor the pups to ensure that they're in good health and they're also nursing with that mother. So it kind of shows that they are being accepted with that mother. It allows them to get really hardier, ready to travel. But also we want them to be young enough that their senses aren't very developed yet. So they can't really see well, can't really hear well, which also helps those new pups acclimate to the rest of their siblings, as well as those adult wolves within the pack as well. Now, litter size is also an important thing that we're trying to look at. Now, when it comes to litter size, for our wolves under human care, we want to make sure that their litter is big enough, so typically 4 or more pups, so that if we take pups away from that mother, that's not going to stress her out too much. Wolves are pretty used to losing pups, usually less than 50% survive. So having enough pups that we can remove some without stressing out our wolf in captivity. And then for our wild wolves, we want to make sure their litter is small enough so that if we do add 2 new pups, that is not going to stress out our adult wolves and kind of make them accommodate for pups that they cannot handle, right? So typically we want 6 or fewer pups in our wild wolf den and 4 or more pups in our captive wolf den. And then of course, overall health of these pups. We want to make sure the pups entering that den site isn't going to be spreading diseases to any of the other pups, as well as they just have good health in general. It's going to increase the likelihood that they're going to be able to survive and reach adulthood out in the wild as well. So those are really the 2 main methods that we release wolves, that adult releases, as well as those pup releases through cross-fostering. But what are the impacts of these reintroductions? We obviously have some really positive impacts, but we also have some negative ones as well. So when it comes to our ecosystems, we do see things like wolves being able to kind of regulate ungulate populations. Now, ungulate is just a really fancy word for hoofed mammal. So that's things like elk, deer, moose, anything with a big hoof at the ends of their feet. Typically, when wolves were removed from a lot of these ecosystems, those herbivores, our hoofed animals, their populations exploded. There wasn't an animal on the landscape keeping those populations down. Now, obviously, being this large herbivore, they ended up affecting the rest of their ecosystem by eating too much of the vegetation. So, with wolves entering a space, they can kind of bring down that population and can really help a lot of different things of what we call kind of that trophic cascade. Now they can also do things like help scavengers on a landscape as well. When wolves aren't on a landscape, there's going to be a lot of carcasses during the wintertime and not as many carcasses or already dead animals during the spring and summertime. So for things like our coyotes, our scavenger birds like ravens, bears, they're not going to have a lot of food during that spring and summer when wolves aren't on the landscape. Now, we have been talking about a lot of the good ecosystem benefits our wolves have, but we also have conflicts with wolves as well, us and humans. Usually, wolves are pretty neophobic, meaning they're scared of anything new to them. That includes us humans. So, a lot of the time, wolves are going to avoid being around people, but obviously, coexisting in the same areas, naturally, our interactions are going to increase. So some of the conflicts that we have are things like depredation. So this means the killing of our domestic animals, whether that be livestock or even our beloved pets. Natural fear of wolves is also an issue, as well as that hunter and wolf competition are some of those issues that we have with wolves as well. So when it comes to trying to decide when we should reintroduce wolves, the real challenge for conservationists and biologists and researchers is trying to find the balance between our ecosystem benefits and the human conflicts that or the wolf and human conflicts that we have with them. So really the main goal of reintroductions is to increase the ecosystem benefits by decreasing the conflicts that we have with wolves as much as possible. So it's kind of this very interesting balancing act that we have to decide when it comes to reintroducing wolves to a specific area. Typically, we're going to try to do it in wildlands, aka areas where there are not a lot of people. And so with that, let's actually go through some examples of these reintroductions and talk about kind of the process of it and what happened and how it's looking today. Which we're going to be focusing, obviously, in the United States. That is what we know best. And so these three stars that we have is really what we're going to be focusing on. Now, by looking at this map, you might remember the map at the very beginning. Wolves were really only here in northern Minnesota and Alaska at one point. So around the early 1900s was when we extirpated these wolves. However, you can see now these blue areas, this is where a lot of them have been reintroduced, as well as these red areas are where red wolves have been reintroduced. So let's kind of focus on those three different methods and what happened. So let's first talk about our red wolves here. Now, red wolves, they actually used to take up all of the southeastern United States. So all of that red area. Now, being large social carnivores, they do need a lot of wildlands and spaces. And so again, just like our gray wolves, the same thing happened to them, where that overhunting and habitat fragmentation led to them by 1972 to only occupy this very small red area in Texas and Louisiana. At that point, there were only 14 wild wolves. And so by 1973, researchers captured those 14 red wolves to bring them into captive facilities to start the Red Wolf Recovery Program. So let's talk about that. So 1973, we took in those 14 wolves to help kind of increase that population in captivity first in order to start kind of bringing those wolves back into the wild. So in 1987, red wolves were then released back. I believe it was 4 pairs of those red wolves under that human care were released. So 2 pairs ready to have pups, ready to start their pack. And then by 2012, that wild wolf population reached to be about 120 animals, which is a really great increase from just that 14, right? However, after 2012, we did see a pretty significant decrease in these populations as well. Now, just like our gray wolves and really all the other wolves all around the world, they suffered from a lot of similar things. So we have things like human causes of death, illegal shooting of red wolves, even just hunters mistaking these wolves as coyotes. They look very, very similar. Even roadkill, getting hit by cars, natural causes like starvation, parasites, disease, conflicts between red wolves really caused them to decrease quite a lot. And then with that, in 2019 to 2021, there are actually no red wolf pups born in the wild during that period. So let's kind of talk about what's happening today. With kind of that decrease, where have we gone from there? Well, in 2022, we saw a litter of red wolves born in the wild, which was a great increase. Now, we're still low from that 120 range. However, today, we do see there's about 20 wolves currently in the wild. 17 of them are collared and still being tracked. And then there's about 260 in captive breeding facilities, places like zoos and sanctuaries, still trying to work to bring up these wild populations. And so, with that, let's kind of move on to the Mexican gray wolf. Now, the Mexican gray wolf is still a gray wolf. Really, the only reason they have that Mexican gray wolf title is so that they can have a little more protections. So I mentioned the gray wolf is under threatened. The Mexican gray wolf gets a little more protection by having this completely different name. Now, really, the big reason it has a different name is because this population of wolves is the second most endangered population when it comes to wolves. Obviously, second to our red wolves there, right? So just like the other wolves, by the mid-1900s, they were completely removed from that southwestern United States. Before 1915, there were thousands of wolves, not only in Mexico, but also in the southwestern US. And so by the 1976, when they were put under protection, there were only about 50 gray wolves in that area. So what did we do to kind of increase that population? What has been the method that we're using? So obviously, very similar to things like Yellowstone as well as Royale, they did a lot of just adult releases, not too much of that cross-fostering. And so there was a minimum of around 257 wolves currently in the US, mostly in New Mexico and Arizona. So a really good increase from just that 40 number, or not 40, 50. And then less than about 400 are also in captive breeding facilities, just like our red wolves in Mexico and in the US, also trying to increase these populations as well as trying to figure out better ways to coexist with these animals. And then lastly, I want to finally wrap up by touching on Yellowstone National Park. Now, this is probably the most well-known wolf reintroduction kind of study that happened. It got a lot of attention, especially due to that trophic cascade, right? Which I'll talk a little bit about. However, even though Yellowstone is super well known, it's also a little bit misunderstood. There's a lot of misinformation when it comes to Yellowstone. So, yet again, by the mid-1900s, wolves were completely removed from this Yellowstone area. And what we saw was those prey populations, our bison, our elk, explode in that population, which of course affected the rest of that ecosystem. So what we did was in 1995 to 1997, 41 wild gray wolves moved from Canada and Montana were brought to Yellowstone. So we started with 41 wolves there. Now, they both used, or in this study, they used both soft releases and hard releases. Now, most of these wolves did a soft release. They found that when they did hard releases in Yellowstone, most of the wolves simply just walked back from where they came from. So a lot of the times they tried to use soft releases, but occasionally would attempt those hard releases. As of 2024 in Yellowstone, we have about 124 wolves now, with them in about 10 packs. Now, talking about how Yellowstone is a little misunderstood really comes from that trophic cascade misinformation. Now, yes, wolves do impact their ecosystems and can definitely impact it in really positive ways by being that keystone species. However, wolves do get a little too much credit. For example, no research has proven that impacts on birds, beavers, or rivers are directly or solely due to wolves being back on that landscape. Now, again, are they having a positive effect? Definitely. But by simplifying all of those changes to just the wolves, kind of oversimplifies ecosystems and might confuse people of how actually intertwined everything is in these wildlands. The impact that wolves have are different in every ecosystem as well. So, although they did a really good job in Yellowstone, we saw a lot of vibrance, a lot of those trophic cascades, a lot of things changed. Using the results of what happened in Yellowstone to every ecosystem and every reintroduction program is not going to work, right? All the animals that are living here, all the plants that are living here are not going to be in every other place. So again, simplifying this all to just the wolf being the main reason that all of this changed gives people the wrong idea of how wolves might be able to change the rest of the ecosystems we reintroduce them to, right? So by learning about reintroduction and kind of understanding these different methods we used, as well as some misinformation we can find a lot with these reintroductions, why should you guys even care about all of this information? And really the big reason you should care is because your opinion actually does matter. A lot of the survival of these wolves and a lot of kind of how these reintroductions actually get started is due to public opinion. So us voting, us being educated in these animals. Now, there's a lot of misinformation we can find in our media. They have a tendency to go to those two extremes, either over glorifying wolves or also over villainizing them, which isn't always scientifically accurate. So when we go into the world and we read and we hear things about wolves, we can do our best to try to fact check it, go back in our brains, think of all the things we've learned, and maybe parse through some of the true things and some of the false things that we're actually seeing to help us really use our best educated opinions by basing it off of all of that research. Now that is going to wrap up our program here today. So I'm going to hop back to our live cameras and then hopefully be able to find our wolves here and we can start our question and answering session. So I'm getting, what is my favorite type of wolf? So that's pretty hard. I would probably have to say, probably because I interact with gray wolves a lot more, I would probably have to say gray wolf. I've never interacted with red wolves before, but they are super interesting animals. Again, they're more of those southern wolves, so it's kind of interesting how they change or differ a little bit from gray wolves who live in typically more northern regions. What is an endangered species, or what is an endangered species of wolves? So for gray wolves, my rough estimate, there's probably over maybe 200,000 wolves all over the world. So that's why gray wolves have the threatened category. Some ecosystems, there's a lot of gray wolves. Some ecosystems, they're no longer there. For red wolves, they have that critically endangered species kind of title because they're in such a small area and there's only maybe 20 in the wild. So red wolves kind of have a higher chance of being fully extinct rather than gray wolves. They're kind of only missing from certain ecosystems. Also asked, is there a favorite food? So just like humans, wolves have their own favorite foods as well. So for our wolves here at the center, for example, Kaz, who we're seeing kind of snoozing from behind, his favorite food is beaver tail. So he is a big fan of beaver tail. It's basically like wolf ice cream when we freeze it for them. Grayson, our white wolf, he loves salmon skin particularly. Normally, Grayson does not defend his food, but when salmon skin is involved, he will defend it very, very well. Which one has the highest population? So gray wolves are going to have a much higher population than red wolves. I think there's only about 300 red wolves all over the world versus gray wolves. Again, there's maybe a little over 200,000 all over the world, right? Do bears hunt wolves or wolves hunt bears? So in places like Alaska, bears actually do take up a portion of a wolf's diet. Now, are wolves actively hunting bears? Probably not. They might just be eating bears that are already dead. as well as whether a wolf or a bear would win kind of in that fight. It depends on the size of the bear and probably how many wolves are actually involved. So definitely that's a toss-up of who would win in that situation, but definitely wolves will eat a bear. Has a wolf returned back to the wolf rehab center? So our wolves here at the center, they actually stay here their whole lives. And that's because they're here for education. We don't rehabilitate wolves here. There are places that do. But here in Minnesota, since we have such a healthy population, we don't actually reintroduce wolves here anymore. Actually, we never did reintroduce wolves here in Minnesota. We've always had a population. So these guys, they stay here. Why do we want higher numbers? Will it make our world better? So that's a good question. So when talking about, do we need a higher number of wolves? It's a bit of a complicated question. So again, in some areas like Alaska, we have a lot of gray wolves in Alaska. And so we actually have a hunting season for wolves in Alaska. And that's because just like we have hunting seasons in the South to kind of help out with deer populations, it's kind of the same with the wolves up there. However, in places like Yellowstone, there's only about 124 of them there. So definitely a good population, but maybe not enough to fully sustain it. So again, it really depends on what ecosystem we're talking about. Conservationists really need to decide whether it would benefit that ecosystem and kind of outweigh the human conflicts that we might have in there as well. So Colorado is a pretty good example of this debate. There was pretty heavy debate on not wanting wolves in Colorado and people wanting wolves in Colorado. So definitely that opinion can change from each person you ask, whether they think more wolves would be better or more wolves would be worse. Do they ever howl or howl at the moon? So yes, wolves howl. Now wolves are really howling just for long distance communication with one another. So kind of the concept of wolves howling to the moon, it is a misconception. However, probably where that theory came from was when there is a full moon, it's easier to see at night, which means the wolves are probably going to be a bit more active, which might increase the amount they howl. So they aren't howling at the moon, but definitely they do howl quite a lot. They'll communicate with wolves that aren't a part of their pack. They'll howl and be like, hey, don't come over here. This is our territory. Or if a wolf gets separated from their pack, they can howl to kind of find their way back to them. I've had a husky named Luna, and it looks like a gray wolf. Yes, a lot of our dog breeds, we did sometimes breed them particularly to look more like a wolf, which is kind of interesting. But yeah, definitely some of our breeds of dogs, you can definitely tell that they descended from those wolves. How many do you have there now? So we have 4 wolves here in total at the center. Now we do plan to adopt 2 new pups next summer. So if you've ever wanted to see pups or maybe check out some pup stuff, coming to our website, looking at our live cams, or even visiting the center would be a good time to meet them as well. Can gray wolves live anywhere? Not necessarily. Typically, they are going to stay more on the kind of top half of our globe. They definitely work a lot better in pretty colder climates. And that doesn't mean we can't find a wolf in the desert, but we're probably not going to find a wolf in the rainforest or in Africa or anything like that. But maybe they could adapt to one day move a bit further south, but probably not going to happen. Has any wolf needed surgery before? Yes. So we have had a few wolves that maybe need surgery here and there. A lot of the time it does get a little complicated when a wolf is injured. Removing a wolf from their pack can be a little dangerous. A lot of the wolves in that pack might think that that wolf is leaving, basically dispersing from their pack. And so it can be risky trying to bring them back into the enclosure. The other wolves might not accept them back. So we try to do our best to do everything as quickly as possible, as well as if it's not an extreme injury, allowing them to just heal out in the enclosure. Wolves are very, very hardy. So typically we don't have to do anything other than just make sure they get antibiotics, nothing gets infected. But a lot of the time, the wolves can kind of heal on their own. Do wolves ever compete with each other? Yes. So wolves are very territorial. So what that means is wolf packs, they're basically living in one particular area that they are not going to let any other wolf or any other wolf pack try to enter and take their food. So wolf packs, they do have conflicts with one another. Wolves do have a tendency to kill other wolves that aren't a part of their pack. So definitely they do compete with one another. What got you so interested in wolves? Well, I personally got really interested in wolves first when I actually learned about Yellowstone. I learned about Yellowstone and those trophic cascades, which even I learned was a little misleading as well. But it made me realize really how important carnivores are to a landscape. I never really thought about it before, as well as how culturally significant wolves are. Was also really interesting, that wolf-human relationship that we have. You know, we domesticated them to have dogs, but we still have conflicts with their wild counterparts, the wolf. It was all just very interesting to me, not only ecologically, but also kind of culturally as well. Do gray wolves mate with red wolves? If so, what are they called? I do not believe red wolves mate with gray wolves. Today, they aren't in the same areas anymore, so there's probably not many studies about them doing that. And a lot of the times, again, wolves, they're really going to see any other canine that isn't a part of their pack as a threat. So if they met a red wolf, they're probably going to fight with them rather than get to know them, if that makes sense. Who is higher on the food chain, wolves or bears? So again, that's a little tough. They're definitely both apex predators. Nothing is actively hunting a bear. Nothing is actively hunting a wolf. So usually it's kind of competition and maybe desperation of who might eat who in those situations. If the only food available, not meat, will they eat it? Depends. So if we're talking about kind of out in the wild, wolves will, if they can't find a food source of meat, they will forage for things like blueberries, so just wild berries. Now they're still carnivores. They're still going to need meat in their diet to survive, but definitely eating those wild berries can kind of help them bring down their hunger a little bit. We also see wolves nibbling on grass, whether they're eating that for sustenance or maybe something else, we're not 100% sure. But they definitely need meat in their diet to survive, but they will maybe rely on other things if they cannot find meat. How many types of wolves are there? So there are only those two species of wolf. The gray wolf, which is all over that northern hemisphere, and then the red wolf, that's now only in eastern North Carolina. Now, again, there's a lot of different names for gray wolves. Again, they'd be called timber wolves, Arctic wolves, plains wolves. All of those wolves are still gray wolves. It can get a little confusing. So it makes it easier just to do the two, gray and red wolves. How much do they shed? Quite a lot. So wolves grow in their undercoat in the wintertime and then lose it in the springtime. And they lose a lot of it. These guys are really built for the winter. And so even sometimes they shed so much that birds will come down and take some of their sheddings to use it for their nest and things like that. How long can they live? So in captivity, free food, free medicine, they can live about 12 to 15 years. It's very similar to our domestic dogs. Now, out in the wild, it depends a little more on where we find them. So here in Minnesota, they typically live about 4 to 6 years. Now that's skewed pretty young, mostly due to pup mortality. I mentioned that usually less than 50% of pups survive up to adulthood. So if they make it to 2 years old, wolves can definitely make it up to that 8, 9, 10 range, but typically it's very, very hard to get there. Can wolves mate with coyotes? So yes, they can actually mate with coyotes. Actually, that is where historically we actually think red wolves came from, was that combination of gray wolf and coyote. Now, today, it's very, very rare for wolves to mate with coyotes. Again, they are very territorial. They don't like any other canines. So typically, if they meet a coyote, they're probably going to try to run it off or kill it before, again, getting to know it. But they do have offspring that can mate. So they can technically hybridize. It is just going to be due to humans if that is actually happening. Normally in the wild, that's going to be very, very rare. What can happen to a wolf that gets lost from a pack? Yeah, so that's usually going to happen when they're very young. And sometimes they can pass away due to that. They can't find their family anymore, especially once the wolf pack starts actively traveling really, really far distances from the den site they were originally born into. But sometimes they do also find each other by howling into the sky. If they're young enough, they might still have what we call a rendezvous site, which is basically an area in their territory the pup knows to go back to if they do get lost. So there's different methods that they use to find each other again, but sometimes sadly it doesn't work all the time. So are wolves my favorite animal? No, actually. Foxes are actually my favorite animal. Do they howl to find each other? Sometimes. Definitely if they're howling within their pack, maybe they're hunting separately, they can all howl and then kind of find and meet up with each other in the same spot. Wolves that disperse from their families, they'll also howl to find a mate as well. So kind of like how bugs, they'll make noises to find each other, wolves will howl to find each other as well. How long do wolves typically live? So again, in captivity, about 12 to 15, and out in the wild, about 4 to 6. Do they like apples? Surprisingly, no. Sometimes Rika tends to like fruit a bit more than the rest of our wolves, but normally they are not going to be interested in fruit or really vegetation. Has a wolf ever died here before? Normally of natural causes is typically how our wolves are going to die. Things like cancers, like our domestic dogs die of, as well as chronic illnesses. But no wolf has ever died from like another wolf or anything like that. Do wolves live in any other continents? So yes, so wolves are living all over that northern hemisphere. So they are in Europe, they are in the northern parts of India, Asia, kind of all those areas. Mostly where we're not going to find them is places like Africa and South America. Are maned wolves real? Yes, so maned wolves are real, but funnily enough, they aren't actually a wolf. So they are still a canine, but they aren't technically a wolf. It's kind of a misleading name. Now, the real reasons of why they're not a wolf, I think it's due to more of genetics as well as kind of their ecological role. It doesn't really match up with wolves. But I think because they look like a wolf, they're a canine, they kind of just got that title. Do you get poachers? Yeah, so poaching still happens to this day. So basically that's just illegal hunting of wolves. It definitely still happens today. A lot more rare than it was obviously back in the day. But it definitely does still happen. Do they like to play with toys? Actually, yes. We give our wolves things like enrichments. Now, a toy for our wolves is probably a little different than a toy for your dog. We'll give them things like deer legs or maybe a gourd stuffed with a bunch of meat or maybe some scented bubbles or something like that to kind of engage their brains, keep them interested in what's going on around them. What happens to them during severe weather? So these guys are really built for severe weather, particularly cold severe weather. Normally they're not going to live in areas where it's super, super hot. And if they do, they have some physical adaptations to help them out. As well as colder climates, they also have some physical adaptations. So normally these guys are perfectly fine just being out and about. But under dire circumstances, wolves will find like a den or some sort of shelter to protect themselves as well. What's the most common wolf? It's going to be that gray wolf. What is the biggest and smallest wolf breed? So again, there's not breeds. That's more of our kind of domestic animal, our dogs. But the gray wolf is going to be larger than the red wolf. Usually more southern animals are going to be a little bit smaller than those northern ones. They're going to be a little bit bigger. How much do wolves eat every day? That ranges quite a lot. Wolves live off of what we call a feast-famine diet. So what that means is they're basically going to gorge themselves. They're going to eat about 20% of their body weight in one sitting, and then they're going to wait 7 to 10 days before maybe eating another large meal like that. So it depends on the size of what they caught, as well as how many wolves are in that pack, depending on how much they're going to eat each day, or maybe the distance between they actually start to eat again. Has a wolf killed another one? Not in our enclosure. We've never had a wolf kill another wolf here at the International Wolf Center, but definitely wolves in the wild. they do kill other wolves, especially during those territory disputes. Are gray wolves endangered? So they are still under the Endangered Species Act. So they still have protections. However, they are under the title threatened. So basically what that means is state by state kind of decides what they want to do with wolves rather than federally no hunting and all of that kind of business. While those red wolves, they have that critically endangered. So they have a lot more protections than wolves do, even though they're both under that Endangered Species Act. What state are we in? So the International Wolf Center is in Ely, Minnesota. Why did they become endangered or how? Yeah. So we saw on our map that our blue was kind of where our wolves were, and then the red is where they've been extirpated. So what extirpated means is that at one point, wolves were removed due to overhunting of them, as well as just habitat fragmentation. So human expansion, particularly after European settlement, kind of removing a lot of the habitats that were really good for the wolves, led to that decreased population, along with us overhunting them, also kind of eradicated them completely from the United States at one point, except here in Minnesota. Can you eat wolves? Probably. I don't know if it would taste good, but I'm sure it did happen. What is the medical pen? I see you're reading our different things. So the medical pen, I'll show it off. This is where if we did have a wolf that was maybe injured or maybe needed a vaccine or to take their temperature, we would be able to bring them in this area to basically shut this door and maybe separate them from the other wolves if we don't want them messing with this wolf while we're giving them either a vaccine or whatever needs to be done for them. What environment do wolves live in? So typically they're going to live in a lot of different biomes. You can find gray wolves all the way up in the Arctic Circle. You can find them in forests, deserts, grasslands, a lot of those different biomes we find all over the top half of our world. Is anything illegal about wolves? I don't know if I fully understand the question, but it is illegal in some states to hunt wolves. It's illegal to sell wolf parts. So like you can't sell furs of wolf, you can't sell teeth or any of that because of that Endangered Species Act, them being underneath that. Which is the most dangerous type? That's also a little bit of a complicated question. Red wolves and gray wolves, they are both still wild animals. So it is good to have kind of a healthy, not necessarily fear, but a healthy kind of understanding that they are an unpredictable wild animal. So although it is pretty rare for wolves to be aggressive towards humans, there's only been 2 deaths in the last 60 years in all of North America due to wolves. So you don't really have to worry about wolves too much attacking humans or them being really dangerous towards us. But for things like our livestock, our pets, it can be a little bit more of that danger there. How high can they jump? Very, very high. These guys can jump, I think it's about 10 feet. They can jump very, very high. Our wolves have actually caught birds by jumping super high. So they can definitely jump high. Can any dangerous animals get to the wolves in the cage? So no. So our enclosure is fully enclosed and we have a 2-fence system. So if an animal did approach our fence, they wouldn't be able to physically contact with our wolves. But things like small animals are able to get in. So things like ravens, pine martens, rabbits, squirrels, mice, which our wolves typically get to hunt. So they get to use kind of their prey drive even in captivity here. It's a certain way that wolves learn. Yeah, so a lot of the time wolves are going to learn through their older members of their packs. So typically packs are mom and dad, with the rest of their pack members being the mom and dad's kids. And so those young pups learn from their parents. They learn how to hunt. They learn maybe areas to avoid. And that's how they kind of continue on that generation of learning. So yeah, they basically learn from other wolves in their pack. How much water do they need? I'm not sure the exact amount, but a lot of a wolf's water source comes from the carcasses that they eat. So they get a lot of water and nutrients from the animals they're eating. But wolves will also just eat snow. They'll also drink from ponds, lakes, really whatever they have access to as well. Do they ever puke? Yes, they do puke sometimes. Just like when we eat something that might not be great, or maybe gorge ourselves, eat a little too much, they will throw up occasionally, as well as they sometimes get sick and throw up too. Is a pack alpha a real thing? So that's a really good question. So that term alpha, it's not necessarily wrong. Alpha does still indicate that we have leaders of a pack. However, it kind of gives people the wrong idea of what that leader looks like. Typically, people, when you hear alpha, you think big, tough, aggressive, strong wolf that had to fight their way to their leadership role. When in reality, like I mentioned, wolf packs, they're just core families. So kind of by default, mom and dad are the leaders of these packs. There's not really that fighting for dominance. So we now call these two wolves, instead of alpha male, alpha female, we call them dominant male or dominant female, or just simply breeding pair. What is average speed wolves can maintain? They can maintain speeds of up to 40 miles per hour, so pretty fast. Do they climb trees? No, they cannot climb trees. They don't really have the grip or really the claws for that, like a bear or any other animal has. Do you give them prey or carcasses? Yeah, so here at the center, our wolves get 2 carcass meals a week, so things that are already dead. That is typically going to be a white-tailed deer and beavers. Now, like I mentioned, they also get to hunt things in the enclosure, small things like rabbits, squirrels, mice, ravens. They still kind of get to use that prey drive. Do they like honey? I don't actually know if we've ever offered them honey before, so I don't know if they would like that or not, but that might be an interesting enrichment I'll add. How sharp are their claws? Their claws aren't very sharp. They have more of a kind of a blunt end. They're very similar to our dogs. If you have one, very similar to their kind of claws. They mostly use them for things like digging. They're not really using their claws to fight or anything like that. What can they be scared by? So really anything new. Wolves are very, very skittish. Our wolves here are sometimes freaked out by a wheelbarrow. So usually anything that's new to them, whether that be humans, maybe a colored flag in the wind, or even just something they've never interacted with, is typically going to make them pretty spooked and make them very skittish as well. Can they lose their teeth? Yes, wolves can lose their teeth. So just like humans, they lose their teeth. Depending on what tooth it is, might determine how extreme that loss is. Typically, you can age a wolf by their teeth wear, as well as how many teeth they have in their mouth. Are they colorblind? So they're not necessarily colorblind, but they do see less colors than us humans do. I actually think if you look it up online, you can look up a dog's view. It's going to be the same thing as a wolf, and it'll show you what colors they're actually seeing. So they're not colorblind, but they do definitely see less colors than we do. Do they have multiple rows of teeth? No. So they do have more teeth than us. They have about 42 teeth. However, there's not going to be rows and rows of them. It's kind of just one line at the bottom, one line at the top. Do you think they could jump over the fence? Probably not. We do try to keep that fence pretty high up. You might also notice the fence goes outwards. So if they were able to make that jump, they kind of want to be able to get over. So we do keep in mind that they can jump very, very high. And so that's why we adjusted our fence to kind of point out to accommodate for that. Do they like napping in the sun? Yes, especially during cold winter months. They love to sunbathe and get nice and toasty. Even sometimes in the summer, they'll overheat themselves because they love sleeping in the sun so much. Do they swim? Yeah, wolves out in the wild, they can swim pretty far distances. They have interdigital webbing, so kind of what we have on ducks. And so that helps them be more efficient swimmers. Our wolves here, they enjoy the pond, except for Grayson. Grayson doesn't really like the pond, but definitely our younger boys, black swimming cats, they love playing in that pond. Do they catch wild fish while swimming? Yes. So wolves out in the wild, they do hunt for fish. So fish do take up a portion of a wolf's diet, depending on where we find them. And for our wolves, we will also sometimes put fish in our pond to help kind of stimulate them a little bit as well. Yeah.
Great. So, just as we are getting toward the end of our program, at the end of our hour, we just want to remind everyone that you can schedule your very own live virtual field trip with the cameras and microphones on. And that'll be able, there's so many different topics you can actually jump into. So, go ahead and make sure to click that link that I just dropped in there. You can see all the different programs from the International Wolf Center and different ways you can learn about wolves, from pups to them growing up to wonderful programs like what we saw today, which was so great. Thank you so much for your time and sharing all of your knowledge and letting us see all the different spaces. It's always fun to see all the different spaces that you have there, and your wolves, of course. And we want to say thank you to all of our learners. It's so wonderful for all of you just to be learning along with you. Thank you for your questions, your comments, your wonderful participation. It was so, so great today. And this ends our community of learning for this week, but we do want to remind you we are back next week. So we are going to be talking about whales of the ocean, and we're also going to be learning more about First Nations of North America. We're going to look at artifacts, we're going to talk about artwork, and we're even going to hear more about oral traditions. So really excited. Go ahead and click the link. We will meet at the same hour that we met today, wherever that is, where you find yourself in the world. And we will be here Tuesday to Thursday next week. We look forward to connecting with you then. And thank you so much again for your time today. We'll speak to you soon. Bye.